Afternoon, everybody. This is the last panel of the day. We stand between you and lunch, so we will try to keep it as lively as we can. The topic is supply chain costs and opportunities in a changing climate. I think what we're going to talk about is some of the practical applications of the ND-GAIN index for businesses. I'm going to moderate. My name is Mark Gunther. I'm the editor-at-large of the Guardian Sustainable Business website in the U.S., as well as a writer at Fortune magazine. Just going to do really brief introductions because you have them all in your packages. On the far left there is Bob Edwards, who's the managing director of NGP Energy Capital Management, private equity investor in natural resources, energy and agriculture. Next to him is Catherine Winkler, who comes to us from EMC in Boston. She's been Chief Sustainability Officer there for about 5 years now. Next to Catherine is Peter Rollins, who's a partner in Environmental Resources Management consulting firm here in Washington. And to my immediate left is Nancy Gillis. Nancy was at GSA, and for the last 6 months she's been Senior Manager Sustainable Procurement at Ernst & Young. So I think we decided rather than do formal statements, we're going to try and have a little more informal back and forth conversation. But I do want to start with a question for each person up here, and I think we'll start with you, Bob, and just work our way back to me. As you know, NGP helped support or underwrite this index, so I thought I'd ask you what, in the simplest terms, what's the use of this for the private sector? What benefit? You obviously did it because you think it's going to make a difference. What's the positive benefit you think is going to be generated here? Again, focusing on business rather than government.
Sure. Our goal initially was to create a tool by which companies can help rank and prioritize their investments. So when a Coca-Cola or a Pepsi, or for that matter, a chip manufacturer is saying, where shall I site my next factory? They can have a tool where they can include in their investment metrics a component which says, does this country have the infrastructure and the capacity so that their people can get to work in a reliable basis that's not overly impacted by floods, by health impacts, and that they can raise families and have a good labor supply chain, but also that can have a reliable physical supply chain. So, for us, when we started this project, we were aware that adaptation was something that all corporations had on their minds, but no way to measure, no way to even define, let alone measure. It was hard to get people pinned down on what did it mean. So what our simple goal was to create an environment in which people could discuss adaptation and a measurement tool in which we could compare different countries and that could be useful for the private sector in investment situations, not as the sole criteria, but as one of the scorecard metrics that a company considered when they were thinking about the profitability of an investment in country X, Y, or Z.
And how real an issue is it today? Is this something people are thinking about for 5-10 years from now, or do you see climate impacts on supply chains today?
Did you try to buy a hard drive about 18 months ago like I did, an external hard drive?
I didn't.
The shelves at Best Buy were completely empty. Why? Because of one flood in Thailand. Who knew that was it all of the hard drives, or was it one component that goes into all the hard drives? Paint pigment, one factory, the rubber hoses that go into brake assemblies for almost every car on the planet, sort of one company. So these are the types of constraints that we just can't live with anymore, especially as our global manufacturing capacity is going towards the developing world in more vulnerable places. I don't think you will see another call center built in the Philippines that doesn't have a risk assessment that includes coastal protection and vulnerability to storm surge and labor availability. So it's now, it should have been 10 years ago, and it certainly will be on the agenda of every corporation that's investing in the developing world.
Great. So Catherine, first of all, just give us a 20 seconds, what's EMC?
Sure. EMC is an information technology company. We make hardware and software for cloud computing, data storage, data security, data protection, data analytics.
So do you have, I know you have a global supply chain. Do you have assets in the developing world, or is it predominantly you're sourcing from other
It's
companies? And in how many countries, where are they?
It's both. We have assets in 80 countries, and quite a few of which are in the developing world, and our supply chain comes out of primarily 20 countries, most of which are also in the developing world.
What are, if you can say, what are the, say, 3, 4, 5 largest countries? What do the concentration look like?
I actually don't know what the top 3 are, but certainly, there's a high presence in China, in all the what's known as sort of the BRIC plus 13. So certainly China, Brazil, India, Mexico, Southeast Asia.
And have you had any experience similar to what Bob just talked about, where you wanted something and it couldn't get to where you needed it to go because of a weather or climate related event?
So we're in the data storage industry, so yes, we use hard drives. But in fact, we have a very rigorous program called a business continuity program, business continuity planning, that we use for our supply chain. And in fact, we were able to meet our business expectations in spite of the Thai floods, but not easily. I mean, it was by having to invoke our processes for managing disruption in the supply chain. We work, I wish I'd seen the slide for 2013, but for 2012, the number of disruptions we had in our supply chain was very substantial. It was dozens. This is, you think of it as something that happens, what if someday we have a disruption? And the disruptions, frankly, are not all due to climate change. So let's be really clear. This is not a climate change strategy. It's a risk mitigation strategy that includes risks that are driven by, accelerated by, or exacerbated by climate change, but not all due to climate change. It included, remember the transportation strike in France? That impeded our ability to get product to our customers, to get supply from our suppliers. Remember the volcano in Iceland, which nobody can pronounce and I still can't pronounce. Nonetheless, that stopped our people from moving around, it stopped our supplies, it stopped our products. The tsunami was very interesting in Japan because we do work very hard to ensure a resilient supply chain, and maybe I'll talk more later about how we do that. But there was, we found out, a component, a single little component that goes into a bigger component, that goes into subsystems, that comes from 2 companies, both in Japan. We didn't know that because it was so far down our supply chain, we didn't have line of visibility to it at that time. We now do. We now have a much deeper view into our supply chain. So yes, this is very real, very present. This is not a future issue.
Okay. Peter, tell us a little about just your practice so we have a sense of what industries you're working in, and then to what degree the companies that you're working with are aware and acting upon the set of issues we're talking about.
Yeah, sure. So we work across a number of the major sort of industrial sectors: oil and gas, mining, power, energy, manufacturing. We also do a lot of work in support of those industries around the investments that flow, supporting those projects and assets. In terms of what are our clients, the companies in those sectors, I guess it's probably same as across the world. There's a mixed spectrum. Some organizations are very focused and really keen to both understand and put in place the management and mitigation measures. Other organizations, it's still very early in their thinking. They, are still looking at this and trying to determine how important it is. So there's a mixture that we're seeing out there.
And can you talk a little bit about what, let's say, the companies that are most sophisticated in their thinking about this are doing? How are they either assuring business continuity? Are they making, location decisions differently, et cetera?
Yeah.
And all the data that we've seen up here, does it have value to them?
Yeah. So I think there's probably three things that I'd mention there. I think one of the key things that a lot of the organizations we're working with now, it's really around trying to understand the level of risk they're exposed to. So a lot of organizations are still really trying to quantify and understand. You mentioned the idea of perhaps 5 years ago, the work we would do would tend to focus on a physical defined site or asset. Now that thinking is expanding down supply chains, because now there's a realization that if you don't understand your supply chain, you're not going to be able to manage. So I still think there's a lot of that data collection, that internal assessment, internal translation of climate adaptation resilience to the language that those people who are making the decisions will understand. So a lot of the work we're doing is around that. In many cases, it's putting it back to dollar value. If this is an issue, what is it costing the business, or what will it cost the business? In terms of...
Great if you could give us like a specific example, if you can, of a company,
sure.
a location.
Okay, so we're doing work at the moment for a large energy company, and we've been doing a series of assessments of their businesses in Southern Africa. Those assessments are looking at both the physical sites in which they operate and trying to get an understanding of what are the levels of impact they are facing today. And an interesting anecdote there is when we went to the site, spoke with the operational managers, etc., and explained what we were doing, their first response was, "Well, climate change isn't real. We're not having any impacts." When we then rephrased it and said, "Well, what about flooding or lightning or other impacts?" Well, now you mention that. Yes, we have all these downtime. We've got all these problems. So part of it is quantifying and making sure individuals on the ground understand. So this particular organization, one of their business streams and assets, we worked with them, identified that in the last 7 years, they've had $50 million worth of value eroded from that asset due to weather-related impacts. We're also helping them look up and downstream their value chain, supply chain value chains, around where are the pinch points, and if there is weather-related, climate-related issues in the future, how is it going to affect those pinch points, so they can be predicting and understanding the magnitude of financial impact that they would face.
Okay.
Sorry, the other comment, things like the ND gain index. I guess one of the key things that I think is important is we're very advanced around a lot of issues such as, say, the greenhouse gas quantification and mitigation. Adaptation, resilience, however you want to frame it, has been on the agenda for a while, but I think one of the important things is there haven't been that many forums for discussion, and there hasn't been much around trying to put some level of quantification, etc. So I see these kind of indices as really valuable. It's beginning the dialogue, it's getting thinking going, and at least it's starting to get, business to business, organization to organization, thinking and discussions moving forward.
Okay. Nancy, you worked, I know, here in Washington on mitigation, right? Your GSA work, at least, was described to me as trying to work with the big federal supply chain to get them to reduce their emissions. So now you're focusing more, I take it, on risk, adaptation, resilience, et cetera. What kinds of clients are you advising? What kinds of questions are they asking you? I know it's hard always for the professional services firms to name names, but tell us a little bit just about, in bringing it down to ground level, what are the questions you're getting? What are the concerns? What's the level of awareness, and what kind of answers are you giving to folks?
Right. So it's interesting because you're saying when I was in the government, so I was with the General Services Administration, as my bio says, and you can tell I was working for the government because the picture that goes with it, the secret story of government pictures is that they give you no notice. I believe they actually walk the halls. They choose a time in which you're looking particularly unattractive. it's both the government photographers and the DMV photographers who I think work in tandem for those purposes. And then they capture you. I was sporting, because I was at a school event later on that afternoon, I kid you not, the Happy Pirate outfit. So if you looked at my photo and thought, she looks a lot like a happy pirate, you would be correct. So, and that's my takeaway from my government time. So while I was at the government, there really it was to work with suppliers, and it's actually a similar issue that I'm doing now at Ernst & Young, which is trying to, on behalf of the government spend, which there's about $550 billion a year the government expends on products and services, to say, if you as a supplier are not addressing these risks within your supply chain, not just your tier ones, but into the other tiers of your supply chain, those risks are cost. You're paying for that risk right now. You're either paying for it in business continuity disruptions, you're paying for it in insurance, you're paying for it. And that cost, somebody has to bear it. And that cost is then wrapped into the price of the products and services the government pays. So this was the government's attempt to actually address that risk and reduce those costs that way. So now at Ernst & Young, it's a similar activity, but now it's the companies themselves who actually are understanding that there's costs through risks, or actual tangible costs that they're bearing. And I actually like talking about this topic from a supply chain perspective at the close of a session, because I think part of the role is we need to do some kind of really honest assessment. We've had great companies up here. We have a great company up here who really understands and who can talk about climate adaptation, climate change. But seriously, when I go into the majority of the companies, I think to your point, when I ask the question, are you responding to climate change in your supply chain? They're like, oh yeah, weather. It's rained and there's been hurricanes all the time. Check. Well, what about resource availability that's going to be exacerbated by climate change? Oh yeah, that water thing. How do you... So I think the challenge right now for climate within supply chains is as much a terminology and how do you frame it, and that's a lot of what we do. We don't talk to our clients about climate adaptation, climate resiliency. We talk about business continuity. We talk about the risk. We talk about the fact that we get more answers such as we heard here, which is, do you know physically where your supply chain is geographically? Because all of the trend information that we see from GAIN doesn't matter if you don't know. And most often the answer is, I don't know.
Well, they have to know where the first level of suppliers are, obviously,
you know where
right?
You send, well, actually, and it's interesting, no, you know where you send your invoice, and you do frequently know where your tier ones are, depending on how many of your tier ones, but you don't really know where the rest are, because you've never had to have that data element matter to you. You know, and you may know it at country level, and so I would say the feedback for GAIN is, it's good to know at country level, but even to the example of 18 months ago, and the Thailand floods, all of Thailand is not a floodplain. So you would not want to say, oh, don't place any of that in Thailand, right? So you have to get more specific to actually be, I think, relevant to the climate adaptation and mitigation conversation.
I mean, I was actually going to ask you that question. I'll ask anyone else who wants to answer it. As valuable this is as a sort of first crack at the problem, what does knowing the ranking of, say, Australia or Brazil really tell you? I mean, those are huge countries with, you know, it'd be like, or for that matter, the ranking of the U.S. Don't you have to be much more granular to really make something like the ND Gain Index valuable? Nancy?
Well, I was thrilled to hear that when we're here next year, I think this is a great start, and this is information even that you can't find now.
Elsewhere.
So right now, this is fantastic, but it is dependent on getting to a level of granularity, at least for the work that we do. I mean, the question that you'd asked, so if you're looking at a supply chain, where are the risks, right? The first thing is understanding what is a risky supplier, where are critical points in a supply chain, and it's hard to understand. You'd like to be able to say, I have a geographic awareness of my entire supply chain, but if you're somebody like a Coke or PepsiCo or any, or an EMC, 10,000 suppliers, you're not going to go out and say, where actually is your firm? So, but if you were to identify who your critical suppliers are, the ones that your sole provider, the only ones that provide something for you, then you're looking at sourcing question. Are they a sourcer? You're looking at, are they a manufacturer? You're looking at the transportation nodes. All of that has relevance as far as where exactly it is, to understand the risk and the opportunity associated with it.
Yeah, Catherine?
One of the things that really heartened me yesterday in the panel discussions, I don't know how many of you were here, was the discussion about what's the value of an index versus data, versus being able to drill down. And I was really pleased with ND Gain that, it's understood that it's not about, hey, you got a 4 or 40 or whatever, but it's really about, what are the factors? It tells you where to ask the questions, because you can't ask the questions everywhere. You talked about using some ND Gain in a scorecard, for example. We don't use that in our scorecard. What we do use is their business continuity score. And so we work with our suppliers to ensure they have business continuity plans. We help them test. We help test them, actually. We actually have gone through mock trials of the plans with them. We help them develop them. And what goes into the scorecard is the readiness of the company. And what indices like ND Gain do is they tell us what questions to ask and where to ask them.
So you have a scorecard for all your suppliers based on a variety of criteria. One of them is security of supply or business continuity.
Business continuity, absolutely.
Okay.
Sustainability, another, and of course quality,
Right, price.
financial impacts,
Yep.
all of it. Yeah.
One of the great things that Gain did when they designed the index. Sorry. One of the great things that Gain did when they designed the index was they made it completely transparent, and they made it easy to backward engineer it. And the original goal was to say, here's a ranking, and against your peers, Mexico versus El Salvador, why are you, El Salvador, so low in terms of water quality and the ability to provide fresh water to new communities or to new businesses? So that was one of the important design elements, was the ability to easily backward engineer and then to do something about your score, to be able to say to a minister, look, all you have to do is better transportation for your score to go up 50 basis points. Let's do something easy. So that was design sort of principle number one. We always knew that there would be, in fact, we worked in Mexico with Monterrey Tech to localize the index for a particular category. It was small to medium-sized enterprises, and we hope to do more of that. And Joyce promises me that she'll have 3 cities knocked out by this time next year. So that's the logical next iteration, which is from a policy level and a ministerial level, the index has been helpful to influence behavior around the metrics that matter, which we hope we've picked correctly. Transparency, we use the corruption index. Those things matter. And then the next step is to make it at a scale, a city scale, a regional scale, so that it becomes actionable for individuals. And so people can see a difference underneath the umbrella of ND Gain, a local county gain, a regional gain. And we're even having some conversations with in the United States with cities and regions, especially after Sandy. The hubris of us being prepared was completely eliminated, and so and so that's, I think, where we take a very valuable tool and make it more actionable on a local, on a regional level.
To anyone who wants to respond, I mean, to what degree would you be concerned, or should people be concerned, that one impact of moving climate risk sort of higher to the top of the business agenda will move investment, in a sense, to the countries that are the haves already and take it away from the have-nots? And in a way, I'm sure that's not in no way the goal of the index, but should we be concerned that that's an unintended consequence of this, that people are essentially going to take the safer investments and move away from the poorer countries where the risk is greater? Nancy, Peter?
I wouldn't be immediately concerned. I think any business that is looking either at current operations or relocating or new investments, there are so many different factors that they are going to be weighing up as part of an investment decision. I hope that this issue of adaptation resilience becomes one of those factors, but I can't see it becoming the defining factor.
So garment factories aren't going to move from Bangladesh to Denmark because of climate concerns, obviously.
I'd be very surprised if they did.
Interesting move.
I mean, to pick up on the theme that's just been mentioned, the other thing that I think is important is, where we have seen a lot of attention on this is from the financial and investment communities. And it's about protecting their investments in the short, medium, and long term. We have sort of country level information. As governments want to attract investment and continue to attract investment, hopefully they're starting to pay attention to some of this. And as you get the governments, the investors, the companies, it's that partnership and that discussion around these types of issues that's really going to mobilize the action to build up the resilience that is needed. So, as I said earlier in my introduction, one of the key things I think is getting the dialogue going at a number of different levels, because that's really where the biggest gains can be made. Individuals doing it in isolation, you can never solve your supply chain in isolation.
Right.
It has to be a partnership approach, not just private sector, but with governments and public sector as well.
I think that goes to an earlier question that I had raised, where I see this is actually hugely beneficial, because I think you're seeing previously, obviously, when a large company goes in and does a capital investment, there's a concern about that investment becoming a stranded asset, and you've put that into it, and then you're not able to get the gain back from it. So here, though, now you have a resource to be able to go in and say, as you think about how you want to invest in the ecosystem of where you're putting those very valuable assets, what those investments from you, from a corporate structure into that community, into that country, is a win-win for you, that you have your employees having the capability to come in and actually work in the particular manufacturing area because you've addressed those type of threats, and therefore your longer-term capital investment is more secure. You're mitigating those risks. At the same time, the country is able to benefit from that. And I would say, since our organization does help advise at the country level, that they're becoming aware that this is a negotiation conversation that they can have from that license to operate standpoint, that it can be less than just, yes, we would appreciate if you would support a community school, and more so, no, we would appreciate if you address critical infrastructure issues because it serves your needs as well as ours. So I think this is a great tool for that.
So we've focused entirely on the risk side. I heard Joyce and others say that the index here creates opportunities. I certainly see where it could guide government investment, but where are the business opportunities that come from better understanding climate risks, which companies are adapting, countries are adapting, which are most or less vulnerable? I don't really see that.
Well,
Go ahead, please.
so I'll throw out an abstract and a concrete one.
Concrete's always better, but
I know.
do both.
I'll do both anyway. The abstract one, I'm going to talk about shared value. I think more and more companies are looking for shared value opportunities, and that is, how do I innovate around some large-scale problem to create new markets? Joyce talked earlier about growing the pie, and certainly an economy that's based on natural resource capital is problematic. So we need to find other ways to generate economic activity. And so many companies are saying, how do I look at these places? And this is one example of where a company might mine for business opportunity, actually at the lower part of the scale, particularly maybe the countries that are showing an interest and a willingness to improve, but have a long way to go yet. And in a very concrete way, I had the opportunity to speak at a climate conference on a panel on adaptation in Cairo shortly before the first uprising. And they were...
It wasn't due to your speech, was it?
One could hope not. Actually, I'm going to digress for a minute. We have a center of excellence in Cairo. We have employees there, and at that time, our office had to be closed down, and they had to work from home. We had to bring employees back into the country who had been out, and take employees out who were visiting and wanted to leave. And we also had to help provide basic supplies because they were, after a week or so, and really hard to come by. And someone said to me after that, well, that's a really different definition of sustainability, isn't it? And I said, no, it's pretty much the same one. That's what sustainability issues look like. And so we were talking about climate driven disruption of the supply chain, but it's not just floods and tsunamis. It's also geopolitical disruption from issues that are either caused by or exacerbated by climate change. But to go all the way back to my panel session, what several of the governments in North Africa were looking at was cloud computing, which is a technology that we provide, as a means for delivering more resilient government services to their citizens. So that's a very concrete investment opportunity.
Meaning that your data will be safe in the cloud if your servers are flooded in your capital city, kind of a thing.
Maybe, but maybe more what it means is you're stranded and you need help, and your cell phone works and you can get to know what hospitals are running or get to aid, or it's really critical government services. Not that data isn't critical.
Another example that we've seen, for example, in the extractives industry, both from, say, upstream oil and gas and mining. Often those types of assets are located in fairly remote, sensitive areas. One of the biggest challenges in many cases is access to water availability, and of course future issues around how that water supply may decrease, both due to climate change but also increasing competition for that water from local communities, other industry. That's a risk to business, but that can very quickly be turned around, because if organizations, both the organization that is affected, but also its suppliers and support companies, start looking at water efficient technologies, start looking at things like perhaps desalination plants, looking at potential water movement opportunities and the like, that can very quickly turn around, and the opportunity is not only new business for new streams, but it's also making the business or the asset that you're talking about far more resilient, in the sense that it can operate in a lower water availability environment, and in turn that technology, that knowledge may play better as new assets are looked at around the globe.
Interesting. Nancy, you see any opportunities here as the spotlight turns to climate risk?
Yeah, I do, and I think it mirrors some of the comments that were made, but maybe crystallizes it for those in the audience. We are facing the holiday season, and I'm sure all of you are also online at 2 o'clock in the morning attempting to complete your necessary purchases for that. For those of you who have teenagers, something that was brought home to me as far as a climate adaptation gift is washless jeans. And this is because, and here, it does tend to prompt that type of response, but find me a consumer product company that is not looking for a more than 20 to 40% growth in emerging markets, okay? And those are exactly the markets that we're talking about that are going to have resource availability constraints exacerbated by climate change. Those are also the same markets that are going to have some interesting population shifts, right? So if that's who you're selling to, and most of you are trying to actually put some of your supply chain in those particular areas because you don't want to be responsible for having to ship everything, right? Because there's costs associated with the transportation segment of that. So you're optimizing, you want to doing that local. All of a sudden that starts having you think about the product that is known and loved today, I want to carry that forward, but may not be the same version of that product that's going to be there 10 to 15 years. And washless jeans is one of them, just building upon the water availability. Think if you are a detergent, right? How does detergent work when water is not guaranteed and electricity is not guaranteed? Simple things, but that's a lot of money for a lot of organizations. So I think it's just an example of there's lots of opportunities. Those companies who figure out, such as cloud, the same thing, figure out an energy efficiency, a water efficiency, a way of doing more of a closed system to where the country can actually pool some of that. It's going to be disposed of likely in that particular area, that they can deal with the disposal issues. Those are opportunities for products and companies that I think are being hopefully explored now.
Bob, I know your company works in or invests in agriculture as well. Have you looked at the climate risks / opportunities for agriculture in the developing world? I mean, are we talking about, water crops that do well with less water, are more heat tolerant, et cetera? Or are we out of your area of expertise here? I know you come out of the energy business, so maybe I'm pushing you in the wrong direction.
I mean, you can't talk about global agriculture without, these are front and center issues. And so the right type of seed technology, the right type of nutrition and inputs that go into agriculture are everything when considering the robustness of an investment. We have looked at some investments. To date, we've been focused mainly in agriculture in North America, but we're looking at South America. And the supply chain risk is, from our standpoint, an opportunity, because the investment in ports and roads and rail and grain handling and storage are all can be seen as, supply chain risk mitigants, but it is an opportunity beyond just the classic insurance products that we can visualize as being part of the adaptation solution. So physical infrastructure to build capacitance is absolutely part and parcel of what's on the agenda of the ABCs, the Archer Daniel Midlands, the Bungys, the Cargills, the global grain companies. And so I think you will be seeing more demand for the type of risk metrics that ND Gain has pioneered in terms of fostering at least direction towards investment, if not exact investment decision or governance. So yes, in agriculture it's everything. In oil and gas, and energy, it's vital and critical. There's no power plant, no scale power plant, 500 megawatts and above, that operates without cooling. And so, water access to provide electricity to bring people out of poverty requires cooling, and by and large it has been a water issue. Now great technology is being developed for air cooling. And these are the type of things that the idea of resilience and building resilience fosters in terms of innovation, switching from water cooling systems to air cooling systems for world scale power plants. At any rate, it's something that is, the world needs a mission to lift people out of poverty and to give them a better life. It's happening. Therefore, it is a developing world issue, and therefore we have an obligation to try to raise the awareness for the vulnerabilities that these people are going to be exposed to. And we're not going to stop people moving into cities. Cities are located on the coasts. That is a vulnerable situation, and so it's incumbent upon us to try to nudge policymakers towards investing in resilience, and for businesses to think about supply chains and other elements of resilience that create the opportunity for people to move from $10 a day to $20 a day, and to move up from the bottom of the pyramid. So, I think this, in a sense, is one of the tools that is part of the noble purpose for some of the deepest problems that the world will have to come to grips with.
So I
Go
just
ahead,
want to
Karen, I have a
add,
question.
I agree with everything you all said, so we're not being very provocative, I guess. But I would add there's enlightened self-interest in this as well. As you talk, in the tech industry in general is really concerned about the shortage of talent, going forward. And we want, well-educated, available, expertise, talent, energy people in all parts of the world where we're doing business. And in order to do that, they have to be educated, and they're not going to get educated if they're not safe and fed. And so it's definitely also enlightened self-interest.
So I have one general question I want to ask all of you, and then I'm going to turn it out to the audience for questions. And the general question is, there's obviously a logic to thinking about adaptation and resilience, but there's also a risk, which is that it could kind of ease the pressure to curb emissions, to mitigate. And I wonder, which direction do you think this, let's suppose adaptation and resilience rises up on the political agenda, it rises up on the public agenda. Do you think it eases the pressure to reduce emissions, or do you think it, by calling attention to the costs and risks of climate change, it could actually grow political support for cleaner forms of energy and reducing emissions? So each of you.
I'll make just one initial comment on that and then leave for everyone else. But 3 years ago, after GAIN was formed, we were speaking at a global conference, and one of the CEOs of a unnamed but very major environmental nonprofit, when asked the question, should adaptation be part of a plank of an environmental policy, said, "Oh, you mean the give up strategy?" Okay? And so it has been in the past, Al Gore banned the word adaptation for a while there because of this very point. He thought that it would relieve the people's obligation to reduce emissions. And you could see that change. That era is over. There is no longer that debate. Adaptation is clearly, call it resilience, call it adaptation. It's no longer an if or type of conversation. It's an and what pace, and how do we prioritize where the resource goes for the greatest bang. And so mitigation versus adaptation is dead. We know we need both. The question is how much, what impact, how not to throw away trillions of dollars on schemes that have no chance of working, both in the adaptation side and on the mitigation side. Prioritize, rationalize, and do it smartly. So I think that era we're finished with. And the question is now how, when, where, how fast, and how much do we allocate?
But I totally agree with you, but let's say I'm a politician, a legislator in Thailand or a legislator in Mexico. I have a fixed budget. I can take some of that budget. I can build roads and dams to make my country more secure, or I can create subsidies for clean energy that's more expensive than burning coal or natural gas.
Well, for
there
him,
are trade-offs, aren't there?
For him, there is no trade-off. Mexico will have no impact on global CO2 emissions and the impact of climate change. So adaptation for him, lifting people out of poverty and creating safe environments for people to live and to work and to raise families is of primacy. It's an issue still for us because we're a wealthy economy and we are guilty about 200 years of spewing CO2 into the atmosphere. So for us and for China and for India, it's a very important question. For the developing world, whether the Pacific Island nations have wind turbines is more of an economic question. It's not a global climate change question because their emissions are meaningless. So, I don't think it's from a developing world standpoint, I don't think really in a practical sense there's that much tension. It is from a policy standpoint as we sit in New York, Washington, D.C., London, and maybe Beijing.
You're saying energy and economic growth have to be number one on the agenda in the poor countries.
No, I'm saying that building resilience and building resilience versus subsidizing low carbon energy should be a pretty easy choice in a developing country.
Okay, great.
I would say, I always find this conversation a bit amusing and sometimes indicative of the fact that you've got too many bright people in the room. Because let's boil it down. Sometimes I've been told you need to speak in metaphors to kind of back away and understand what we're really talking about. So let's just assume it's a bathtub that we've all recognized. Somebody left the spout open and it's filling up, right? So now the water's coming over the side of the tub. So you have the option, right, of you pack it with towels, and that's what we're doing. We're adapting to it. Does that mean that somebody's actually going to say, let's not turn off the spigot? Let's all just now.
We have not turned off the spigot yet.
Right.
We haven't even turned it down. We're actually turning it up a little bit every year.
And so I think when we step away and we actually think about it that way, that just the fallacy of having these conversations about saying, oh, well, if we start talking about adaptation and actually putting the towels up there and making sure that we're stopping some of the water thing, we're all gonna lose sight of the fact that there's something that's causing the water to happen. And then to the point, I thought it was a very, very good point of saying, it's who has the reach to turn it off? It's foolish to talk to those who really, we all understand, really don't have the reach, really can't have the impact to turn it off. A lot of their emphasis is going to be, it's running over, and I got to make sure that I'm not drowning.
Right.
So sometimes I understand we have these. I understand we're in D.C., been for the government, keeps us all busy. That's really great, but I think there's more important conversations to have at times than potentially that one.
So I do think that some people will have that conversation. I'm not sure they'll do it because they really believe it, but that they'll see it as a hook for some other, political objective. But it always happens. But that said, I am hopeful that, in fact, what adaptation is doing is making people realize how real it is. I mean, climate change is so abstract. People just, it's a huge global problem. What impact can I as one person have? I mean, Sandy and Katrina and the typhoon and the tsunami, it can go on forever. Those things made it real. It made it personal. And I am, I'm not hopeful that more people will be damaged by these things, but I am hopeful that when these things happen, people will step away from the rhetoric and all that crap and say, hey, we have to do something about it. And we have to, because no matter how much we spew into the air, more increases our risk. So, we sometimes get confused. We think this 2-degree thing or 450 parts per million or 350 parts per million, whatever it is some kind of a cliff. We're okay below it, and if we go over it, we're done, give up. But it's not that way at all. The more we emit, the higher the probability of really, really catastrophic change. And so we can't give up on that.
I'll offer my thoughts. I guess I think things quite simply just because I have a simple mind. So, but I guess the debate for a long time has been about two different things, but the reality is they're the same. They're one and part of the same issue. Right. If we've got a robust strength and resilience strategy, it's going to mitigate. And equally, the mitigation, if that's strong and effective, that's part of the adaptation and resilience. I know there's time frames and, there's the now versus the future. Right. But I think if that type of thinking, which I think is starting to come along, I think for a long time, mitigation was just viewed as mitigation and no thought on the resilience. We've seen that grow. In the recent COP in Warsaw, there was an awful lot of discussion around adaptation as well as the mitigation side. I'm actually hopeful that the two will be seen as one as opposed to two separate issues.
Peter, we need a term for climate action.
I think resilience covers it still.
But for one thing, I think it's a great point, I think that there is the interconnectedness that's being recognized. And earlier today and also yesterday, there was a conversation about what's the impact of natural capital, right? Our organization is going to start paying more attention to ecosystem services and the valuation. And coming from Ernst & Young, I mean, we're all about understanding how you value and put valuation to things that frequently haven't been valued. I think here, to my metaphor, you're frequently, you're going to start running out of towels to put around, so you're thinking of other things that serve that way. And so all of a sudden, if I've got a wetland, and you can have this conversation now with an organization, you can say, yes, you used to see no value in it, so you pave it over, and then you would think about adaptation and then build a retaining wall. Whereas you already had your retaining wall, but you didn't understand it that way. So I think now you're going to have that adaptation and that mitigation happening in tandem, and things like ecosystem services, natural capital, that's going to be a way to talk about it and serve both at the same time. Very interesting time.
I see a question over there.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for this excellent panel. I enjoyed it very much. My name is Isabel Studer. I'm the director of the Global Institute for Sustainability at Tec de Monterrey. First, I want to address the issue about Mexico. There is a trade-off for policymakers in terms of, whether you use your very scarce resources for adaptation or mitigation. And we have had that discussion in Mexico, and it's going on, especially now with the energy reform, and whether, we are going to be exploiting those hydrocarbons or we are going to be investing in renewable energies. It's a huge issue, and we have a very big social agenda with inequalities and poverty, so it's not that evident. And it is not that evident that emissions in Mexico are not growing. And the projections just in terms of the demand for electricity are huge. So, I get your point in terms of, that there are countries that have this trade-off more clearly than others, but I think Mexico was not a good example because it is really, we are facing these issues now.
I brought it up as an example where there was a trade-off.
Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, and I think that, there is a trade-off in many countries, especially in emerging economies, not only Mexico, Brazil, many others, and it's not only China and India. And I think that's important because these countries, will be very relevant in terms of the implications for the world.
How much of an adaptation conversation is going on in Mexico
It is,
right now?
there is going on a lot. Mexico is one of the most vulnerable countries, and I was very surprised not to see that reflected in the gain index because Mexico is very vulnerable by all measures in terms of flooding, droughts. We have them every year, just recently in, many, many states in Mexico, very costly. And if it is not drought, it's flooding because our geography. So, we'll talk about that in another moment. But the issue I really wanted to address is a conceptual issue. We have a huge program with 3,000 small, medium-sized enterprises that are suppliers for Walmart and FEMSA. What we're doing is training these companies on the introduction of eco-efficiency practices in their production processes, but they are and need to be part of the supply chain. And why are we doing this? Because we are very discouraged by the statistics that we normally get in terms of the national perspective. It's very difficult to say, Mexico is more vulnerable and needs to have this adaptation strategies because there are certain regions in Mexico that are more vulnerable than other regions. So I think by having the supply chain, we move away from this discussion that normally, whether a country is less or more attractive to foreign investment because of, the vulnerability or readiness to respond to the climate change effects. So I think supply chain allows us to actually engage the private sector into looking at their assets around the world and not just looking at Mexico or Colombia or Brazil. certainly public policies do have an impact, but I think the importance of the supply chain from a conceptual perspective and even from an investment perspective is quite relevant because it allows us to look at these investments from a different perspective, not just from, whether this country is good or bad, or it has more vulnerability to climate change or not. And I think for that very reason, the number of initiatives that have been filed at the private sector initiative of the UNFCCC are very encouraging, because it's the private companies that are saying, I have a stake in what is going on in Ghana. I have a stake in what is going on in Russia, because these are my assets, are part of my supply chain. It's not because I'm going to not now, invest in Ghana because they are so vulnerable to climate change and they are doing nothing. Because most of these companies, when you see at the supply chain, is part of the same company. So my takeaway from the session is just that, that we need to move away from the national perspective by looking at the supply chain, because in that way, you can engage the companies more easily into including and developing adaptation strategies, and I may say sustainable strategies, because I think it's much better whether it's mitigation or adaptation. I think it's irrelevant as long as the long-term goal is sustainability. So I think that the supply chain allow us to just do that and move away from the discussion of whether or not there is going to be an impact of the have and have-nots for foreign direct investment.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Interesting. So your 3,000 companies, what you said they're supplying Walmart, and what was the other company they're supplying? PEMSA. Great. Wait, I think let's go behind you and then to there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Louise Leaf. You've been speaking in rather general terms about the gain, and I'm curious from any of the panelists, can you give us a concrete example of a discussion that you've had with one of the developing countries or a country on the GAIN index about their resiliency and adaptation, and what was the result of that conversation, if there was any, where the conversation led, and what concrete steps emerged out of that, out of using the index to show them their vulnerabilities and where they needed to change?
I don't think these folks are engaged at the national level in talking about the index with governments, although I could be wrong. Have any of you met with a government to talk about this?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, go.
So, but as you made kind of the note earlier, we're a bit precluded from actually identifying who that government is. But let's just say that
It was a continent then.
let's say it was an Asian
Okay.
country, not surprisingly, and it was to the point of looking at, first off, where are areas of opportunities to stimulate development, economic development, in a way in which they would be either more attractive to a supply chain, so to larger companies coming in. What could they do to actually improve? Where could they put their own internal, they called it the green growth. A lot of the focus was on energy security. A lot of the focus was on transportation and infrastructure investments. So it was also part of the license to operate conversations. If a supply chain came in, what they should be asking of those particular companies coming in. And so I think GAIN is a wonderful tool for those type of discussions. Yeah, so, and it's being used. From a company side, though, similar thing, we've been asked, I was standing in the foyer of an apparel company when the Bangladesh disaster happened, and one of the staff people ran up and said to the supply chain director there, this has just occurred, I don't know if you've seen it, it's on CNN. And of course, she pivoted and said, are we exposed? And the staff person said, I don't know. And then, of course, because they did not know where their suppliers were. Yeah, but where? Is this one of them? And then the question came, when you're doing your risk analysis, you've got a risk appetite for your company. If somebody were to say, okay, this is not the first time this has happened. If I want to move out of there, if I want to absolutely reduce that risk, where do I go? I'm a large supply chain. Granted, I must admit, we did not advise or review Denmark. Maybe we were negligent in doing so. But it's how do you make sure, and this is where I think the trend data is so important, how do you make sure when you start getting to that advice period that you're not moving from one risk area to yet another? And it's only trend data that's actually going to make you feel confident and secure in that. But you are going to start needing a bit more granularity from that company perspective.
Yeah, I want to get to the whole supply chain context, particularly, Barbara, you mentioned cities. And I think nowhere is the scenario more lopsided in terms of heavily weighted on supply chain, where almost all the material flow and the embedded energy and water as cities have. And I want to throw up a red flag, Joyce, in the context of gain stepping into the city space, right? And I'll illustrate it with an example to back the red flag up. July of 2012. A power outage in northern India. New Delhi came to a grinding halt. 670 million people, 1/10 of the world's population, was affected for a couple of days. And the postmortem has been done, and the results are in, and here's what the cause is attributed, right? Monsoons failed. New Delhi moved into moving a lot of people. The urban areas all over northern India, a lot of electrified public transport, great from the context of mitigation. A lot of the power generation in northern India, particularly in the urban areas, was coming from hydroelectric. Great checkbox from the climate mitigation perspective. When the monsoons failed, a lot of the farmers had to turn to irrigation and turned on the electric pumps. Again, adapting to disruption in rainfall. Tremendous load in terms of the demand side. And at the same time, because of the monsoons failing, hydroelectric power generation capacity dropped dramatically. Nancy, this goes to the nexus you're talking about, the nexus of food, power, and water, that while as individual silos from the mitigation perspective, all green check boxes resulted from the adaptation and disruption and resilience perspective to a significant, I mean, you're talking 10% of the world's population, significant negative impact. So it's very critical once we dive into the city context to focus not on those individual metrics that feed into the composite gain index, but actually the synergistic and antagonistic interactions between those individual dimensions. And I think nowhere is that going to be more important than when you get into evaluating cities.
Interesting, very interesting.
Can I ask a question?
You can. I think it'll be our last one, too.
Okay, great. Catherine, you mentioned that in the tech industry, you think you're going to be facing a talent shortage. And I'm wondering, since we have such a diverse representation of various industries, what issues you think you'll be facing in the near future with risk assessment and understanding costs with the changes we're going to be seeing very soon, and we are seeing now?
Okay, that's the challenges in understanding risk. I think how fast things are changing, and the uncertainties, particularly policy uncertainty. We do and we have sort of a fundamental belief that companies will be held accountable for their externalities, but we don't know how or when, and it's very hard to quantify that, although that is something we are seeking to do, we are working on doing right now. So it's the growing sort of uncertainty and magnitude of the impacts, you know, whether they're geopolitical, whether or actually political, and so I think that's the hardest part when it comes to risk mitigation. Some things that were very hard are getting easier. Transparency of the supply chain. You know, a couple of years ago, we really couldn't see much past 2 or 3 levels in the supply chain, and now, you know, we've done a much better job of being able to map our supply chain and the complexity of that. So that does help us manage the risk better. So it's both getting harder and easier. I don't know if that got to the question you were.
Joyce, do you want to say a word or two, or are we going to wrap up now?
I think we should wrap and go to
Okay, so first, did anyone want to have a final comment? Peter,
Oh,
did you want to-
yeah, I was just going to respond there. I mean, the other, it's a challenge, but I think it's the opportunity as well. Is it's around the thinking at an organizational level, government level, individual level, around the fact that all of this is connected. If we talk sustainability, a much used and abused word, but sustainability ultimately is around the simple fact everything's connected. Whether we're talking lack of talent, we're talking energy efficiency, we're talking adaptation resilience. In the scheme of things, there's connectivity around that. And the sooner we all, as society, organizations, etc., start thinking in that joined up way and recognizing the interrelationships between all these issues, I think that the impacts or the management of those impacts are going to be much better and much stronger and more effective.
Nancy?
And I have one quick, it's almost like, I'm going to show my age here. It's the movie The Graduate, right? We're all in that scene where he's leaning over and he's whispering in the ear, and the thing that he's whispering is systems thinking.
Instead of
That's what this is.
Great.
Unless we come back to big data, but.
So join me in thanking Bob, Catherine, Peter, and Nancy. Do you want to say a word or two?
All right, well, thank you so much, everyone. We're going to conclude with lunch in the dining room, so please join us across the hall. And thank you so much, Mark, for facilitating such an interesting panel. Take care.
Thank you.
Good job.
Nicely done. It was a pleasure.